But so I'm keen to talk about the idea of metaphysics and the way that a focus on metaphysics can illuminate the study of the anarchist teleology and the anarchist canon. Now I'm going to look at that specifically in the sense of how anarchists read other anarchists, and even more specifically how Bakunin in the 19th century, the early and mid, stretching into I think the 1870s, read Hegel. So I'll spell out what I understand the idea of metaphysics to be. I'll also spell out why I focus on it and what I think that it can bring. And I'll also address right now at the very start what conceptual tensions within anarchist studies that I think are a focus and an emphasis on the category of metaphysics, what conceptual tensions that illuminates and try and point towards some of the... So I'll look at a particular chapter within my PhD and highlighting what those conceptual tensions are within anarchist studies that arise from looking at metaphysics. I'll try and point towards the rest of my PhD research, which is done but not written, if you like, stemming from the bit that is both done and written that I've got here today. So I'm particularly influenced by Slavoj Žižek. Is anybody familiar with Žižek at all?
How could you not?
So I don't need to spend, because it's just not relevant for many reasons. It's not relevant to anarchist studies to spend loads of time, if you like, dwelling on Žižek's ideas. But one thing that I was having a conversation with Ruth last night, and one thing that I really think that Žižek allows us to do, you can't get this from reading Žižek because I don't think that he is rigorous enough, perhaps even in his method itself or in the way that he explains his method. But one thing that I do think that Žižek allows us to do is to approach historical sources and political texts within a canon, to approach them in novel ways that unlock potentially new understandings. So in the broad context, Žižek is particularly good for addressing what he calls lost causes. So he quotes Chesterton there. So what are perhaps seen to be avenues, if you like, of political thought that have run so far and then stopped, whether by running out of theoretical steam or through sheer outright repression. That Žižek allows us to look again at political sources in a new way. I'm not saying it's a better way, but I do think, and I'll try to show, how it certainly constitutes a different way to read historical sources and sources within the anarchist canon and Bakunin specifically. I am tempted to claim, despite the availability of courses on historiography and the way to read political and historical texts all over the country. I was lucky enough to do a really good historiography course at Warwick, that I am still tempted to claim that the liberal parameters within which both the kind of, we were talking about it, weren't we, the Oxford Textualist School and the Cambridge Contextualist School of reading historical sources, I am still tempted to claim, precisely because of its basis in liberalism and its associations with liberalism, that it is to some extent unthought, but I wouldn't go too far in that. What I'm simply saying is that Žižek allows us to approach historical sources differently, conceive and experience them differently, and I'll try to show here, in the particular case of a 19th century context, how Žižek, or a Žižekian understanding of Hegel, can help us to see, to recover, if you like, or to reconstruct how radical political thinkers like Bakunin may have read other radical political thinkers like Hegel. So what conceptual tension arises from focusing on, banging on about metaphysics within the anarchist studies discipline? for me, it really is, and the consequences of this, if you like, in my own research, get applied to then coming back again to Žižek and his histories of 19th and 20th century thought. But what conceptual tension is it that arises within the field of anarchist studies from banging on about metaphysics, from being really keen to talk continually about metaphysics? For me, it is a debate which hangs on two conceptions, if you like, of the political and public space. So one would be, if you like, a sort of quasi-Habermasian understanding of the space in which anarchists, the kind of things that we've heard from the two papers earlier. It will be a kind of quasi-Habermasian thing where it's univocal. So if you like, all we have is the people, the thinkers, the activists that choose to self-identify as anarchists, that choose to behave in various ways that could be understood as anarchist, that could create political structures that we would identify as anarchist. That would be, if you like, the more commonsensical understanding of people that are to some extent alone without historical guarantees, that this would be relevant to an age certainly after 1989 where the kind of guarantees of a historical trajectory, for example Marxism, is absent. It would also certainly apply to a world after Fukuyama renounced his own thesis, I think it was in 2005, about liberalism being the kind of historical trajectory to which we could defer, which could inform our actions and so on. So if you like, that for me is the commonsensical, certainly not the worst of the two, just the more commonsensical understanding of history. That best exemplified if you have a look at Simon Sharma's Twitter account. I'm not sneering at Simon Sharma. I like Simon Sharma. I think it's good. But if you look at Simon Sharma's Twitter account, he says something like the past isn't dead, it's not even past, and he attributes that to someone called Faulkner, whoever he is. But I'm tempted to say that even for a Simon Sharma who would devote pages and pages to the way that historical sources are approached and engaged with, that I would venture to say that he's not doing what I would call kind of metaphysical or an appreciation for the category of metaphysics. Now, the problem that I have encountered previously, conferences, whatever it might be, about introducing the category of metaphysics as Žižek does into the study of historical sources and historical texts. The problem that I've come across personally, time and time again, is that sometimes it can seem very abstract and maybe even a bit orthogonal to what's going on. That it can seem jarring. The interesting thing about Bakunin, specifically as a 19th century anarchist, this is a real strength and a beauty of studying Bakunin specifically, is that for someone like Bakunin, not simply because of the extent to which German idealism, Kant, Hegel, I think also Fichte, not so much Schelling, had permeated into Russia, and there was groups of young people in Moscow that were studying German idealism and were interested in it. Not so much for that reason, but just because in order to unlock the really radical brackets anarchist conceptions of the state and society that Bakunin made it his project to be able to articulate, that Bakunin needed to conceive of his sources. So Bakunin as a political thinker needed to read, I argue, other political thinkers in a very radical way, and I'm going to try and show now what that way is. So if you like, you could bracket this paper, why Bakunin doesn't read sources the way that Simon Sharma does, I guess. Right? So I'll just briefly explain the title, if you like, in my paper, because this is a good moment to just explain that. So the three are the kind of thematic header for either the stream or whatever it might be, and I think was rebellion, resistance, and revolution. Now, hinging around that dichotomy between, I haven't elaborated the second one yet, but hinging around that dichotomy between two different ways of understanding history as such. So, hinging around that dichotomy, then I've lost my train there. What I will do is elaborate the second way of conceiving, of reading historical and political sources, and I'll elaborate that specifically in terms of the way that Žižek explains it. So, Hegel, I don't know how familiar people are. But Hegel, if you like, constructed a system whereby the ways in which meanings and historical materials would link together. So he kind of articulated a nexus, if you like, of sometimes simplified by one of his followers, Karl Rosenkranz, as thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. So thesis, the intervention into the sphere of history as such, the antithesis, that which opposes it, and the synthesis, the ultimate resolution. So the second way, if you like, of conceiving of history as such, the brackets liberal model would be that history is univocally and simplistically a product, just a product, of the way that alienated people conceive of it. So history as such has no independent existence other than what alienated people conceive it to be. Now, the metaphysical conception of history, the speculative, the idealist conception of history as such, is that history does have an independent existence. That it's interesting, I read a quote this morning from Marine Le Pen when Nigel Farage turned up in the European Parliament and was celebrating his victory and so on. And Marine Le Pen came up with the quote, "Isn't history beautiful?" Now, what I suspect that someone like Marine Le Pen, the way that she would conceive of history, if you like, differently than a Simon Sharma, the way that a Bakunin, and I'll show how this particular second conception of metaphysics of history as such, of reading sources, shows up in Bakunin's work. The way that, if you like, the thinker who is extra to the system of liberal capitalism, statism, as it's conventionally defined, I mean, we obviously talk about that in relation to Marine Le Pen, but what I'm saying is that I suspect that Marine Le Pen, when she says, "Isn't history beautiful?" is that she doesn't mean that history is just the product of what alienated people do. That I suspect that what Marine Le Pen means, someone that comes at the system of liberalism from outside, is that there is, in some sense, there's a nexus, a network of historical guarantees and significations, if you like, that point the way towards a future. So the same way that, for example, in the Soviet Union, there would be this lingering historical guarantee of this bold new socialist future. Now, I suspect that Marine Le Pen sees history in the same way, that to some extent there is, and I'll give a few examples from Hegel in a minute about how this can operate, that the independent existence of history as such, history for its own sake, that to some extent, for someone like Marine Le Pen that comes at the political system from such an orthogonal place, constructs such a different kind of construction of the way that society should be organised, I suspect that Marine Le Pen is placing a kind of an existential wager, a bet, on history as having this kind of independent character, the same way that I'd even go so far as to suggest that she's linking, if you like, to an idealist tradition, an idealist way, certainly of reading sources, interpreting events, that you can trace back to the German idealism of the 1810s and the 1820s. So let's have a little look at the way that Hegel suggests that this independent existence of history works. Then I'll show you, that's fine, and then I'll show you, if you like, how Bakunin conceives of that differently. Now the real point here is that it's a difficult one to sum up and to encapsulate, but if you like, for Bakunin, someone for whom the sense of an independent history as such was so important, that the transmission, the diffusion and the diffraction of that sense of a history behind the scenes pulling the strings was subject to a process of negotiation and contestation by Bakunin himself. So he didn't see that he was reading Hegel just as another thinker. I hope to show you that by looking at the category of the rabble, how Bakunin believed that Hegel had altered the parameters of the world as such, that Hegel had in some sense, maybe we can address this in the questions, that Bakunin felt that Hegel had created by literary means, by textual means, this independent sense of a history as such. So I'll just quickly read you a bit from Hegel himself. Let's see. Well, I'll just cut to an analysis of Bakunin. So I say the single important way in which Bakunin interpreted Hegel's maxim of the real and the rational differently than Hegel did was his deletion of the place of metaphysicality. So Hegel created it, this independent sense of a history, and in Bakunin it's subject to a contestation. So in Hegel, the ultimate knowledge of the real and the rational gets shared between the place of metaphysicality as an entity and its contingent manifestations in materiality. Hegel wrote in his philosophy of history that metaphysics is exposed to danger, it remains in the background, untouched and uninjured. This is called the cunning of reason, that it sets passions to work for itself while that which develops its existence through such impulsion pays the penalty and suffers the loss. Hegel talks about the way that a worker, where a Marxist would express concern that a stratification, compartmentalisation and specialisation of labour and commerce would contribute to an entitlement division, with the bourgeoisie cementing their station atop the pyramid. The Hegelian reading, and this is where the sense of an independent history as such comes in, the Hegelian reading is that the exploiters are already themselves exploited the moment they enter the fray. So they're exploited, but not in the sense of a Marxist consciousness. They're exploited in terms of their relationship to this independent history as such. An artisan believes the main aim of his labour to be the satisfaction of material needs. But because it is wholly impossible for any determinate subject to occupy the place of cunning arch reason, his real purpose is just the process of production itself, enacting the processuality of production. Now, what I'll end on, what I'll conclude on, to show the transmission of this abstract sense of history into Bakunin's work, is just to say that in Hegel, you will have a system of social relations where you always have this constituent remainder, if you like, which Hegel calls the rabble. So for Hegel, I don't want to oversimplify too much, but for Hegel, the mechanisms by which the rabble could be reincorporated back into society, the social body as a whole. So the mechanisms by which the social class who, I think Hegel, it's a phrase from Hegel, that they're a part of no part, they don't fit, links quite well to some of the idea of the people that might inhabit the messy spaces that you were talking about. The part of no part, the mechanisms by which they are reincorporated back into the social whole, What I'm interested in with Bakunin is the way that Bakunin elevates the incommensurability of the rabble, those people in society for whom it would be important to the anarchists to articulate their needs and political desires. That Bakunin elevates that note, if you like, of incommensurability, of that incompatibility, into the very principle in which to subsequently organise a social order. The key is that Bakunin doesn't see himself, if you like, when he reads Hegel, he doesn't just see himself as taking a set of ideas, so in the Simon Schama sense, he doesn't just see Hegel as alive and vivid because of maybe Hegel's specific links in a context to the radicalism in Central Europe at the time of the French Revolution. He genuinely sees himself as, when he engages with Hegel, that it's necessary for him to retain, of course, to negotiate over, but to retain this sense of an independent history as such. Now I want to find you a particular line to end on. So, if ontology, and this is how I read Bakunin, and this is how I think that kind of a sense of the metaphysical as a way of reading sources, this is the kind of analysis that it can help us to unlock. If ontology truly is the product of disjunctions between semiotics and context, as Hegel thought, such a mechanism generates excessivity, and this excess can only be domesticated by philosophical manoeuvring that elides or obviates the gulf, but nevertheless continues to articulate it, the Hegelian negative, as an arrhythmic, rhapsodic silence. Hegel's core antagonism is the trauma about which nothing can ever be said. Bakunin's developmental trajectory is comprehensible within these parameters. Let me just skip to, and then I will conclude. So let me go back to the title of the paper. So, what I would like to suggest, and what I think that studying Bakunin in this way, or looking at the way that political thinkers relate to other political thinkers in terms of their sense not only of an interpretation, but also in the sense of a fidelity, an emotional attachment that can be disassociated from the individuals themselves to become independent, floating presences. Hegel would have said dialectical presences in the world as such. Looking at things in this way, it really, and as I said, so the thesis that I'm doing, this comes right back to the contemporary, looking at Žižek and his ability, or his non-ability, if you like, to talk coherently about 19th century anarchism and 20th century anarchism. But what I think that the Žižekian understanding of Hegel allows us to do is to see that rebellion, resistance and revolution is not just, or not only, something that people do, but that sense of a violence, that sense of a brutality, and the sense of a wager that goes to the very end in the political space, that renunciates all kind of commitments and attachments. That sense of a brutality is not only attributable to people who are alienated from an independent sense of historical guarantees, but that sense, that logic and that modality of brutality and violence is also a characteristic of the world as such, the independent sense of history as such, that Hegel, I would say, created, and I would argue for that, and which Bakunin then came to engage with. Thank you very much.
Can you tell us more about in which text Bakunin does this engagement, from what period in his life it comes, just a bit of that biographical background?
Yeah. So I look at three periods. So I'll just read you the very first sentence. So Bakunin uses Hegel in three distinct separable ways. One, and this is his early period that I can give you examples from the prison notebooks and things like that, while he was still in Russia. So early period, to facilitate a rejection of the ideals of the Enlightenment as a rebellious teenager in the first throes of serious intellectual work. If you want, I can bring up some kind of examples from his Russia period where it's the Tsarist state that is talking in this kind of grandiose way, and in order to address specific localized social problems, the only way that really concrete social problems can be addressed is that Bakunin has to meet the grandiose language of the Tsarist state on its own terms and start talking about metaphysics and stuff like that. Second, sort of middle stage, as a negative point of departure towards socialism. So the period in his life where he became interested in pan-Slavic nationalism and seemed to be going, as he departed from Hegel, seemed to be going towards a kind of broadly socialist understanding of history and the future of the state. And then three, his late period as a faded memory which barely touched his own mature anarchist edifice. So in the late period, his understanding of the rabble, the way that Bakunin understood the rabble, the part of society which is, if you like, a part of no part, had matured to such an extent that, as I say, that he elevated this sense of an incompatibility of the social remainder. He'd elevated that to the extent that it coloured his whole way of thinking. And that's when I feel that he really became an anarchist. I mean, just as a little bit more biographical information, I think it was in the 1850s, the dates are here. But he spent a long time in a Tsarist jail, to the extent that in the end he caught scurvy and all his teeth fell out. Denied access to any kind of reading material really, much at all, except for the point at which he was provided with a paper and a pencil, and he was encouraged or ordered, however you want to look at it, to write a confession to the Tsar where he renounces his radical convictions and so on. But the adolescent Bakunin, the kind of early 20s Bakunin, started to engage with German idealism in the clubs and the cafes and the kind of social halls of, it's actually born in, don't know how you say it, but TVER, the region of, but then moved to Moscow in his early 20s. So by all rights, the really fascinating thing about Bakunin is that he should have followed his middle class dad into military service. Spent some time doing military service in Eastern Europe, and was repulsed and repelled by the treatment by the soldiers of the local indigenous population. So is there anything else specific?
No, that's kind of what I wanted to know, how it corresponds to the periods of his intellectual.
That's what I tried to do, if you like, in my work on Bakunin, was try and separate it out into three periods.
Yeah.
Which is difficult for anyone, but certainly difficult for Bakunin. So
I asked because my reading of the late Bakunin was hard for me to kind of, when you said Hegel, I hadn't really know, but I mean, I think it makes sense in the way that you say how it kind of percolated into the late writings as more of a kind of trace vision, that becomes something that's kind of maybe working at the back of his imagination to structure his words.
Because he wrote God and the State. And
in God and the State, he opens by saying, well, who's right, the idealist or the materialist? Of course, it's the materialists, right? It's kind of seems to have come quite a way away from from Hegelianism in a strict sense, but it's still, but I mean, you know.
Yeah. I mean, he does. I mean, rightly or wrongly, there's a part in here. So I look at Elisabeth Kubler-Ross, right? Which is a Swiss psychiatrist from 1969 that looked at the way that people come to terms with a loss. I really would state the argument that yes, I agree. You're right to be concerned because by these two late texts at the very end of his life, it's inconceivable that he would be talking about Hegel because Hegel would then become like 70 years old, or had been dead.
Well, but also very identified as the kind of apologist for the centralist Prussian state, which Bakunin was not a big fan of.
So by the time of those two late texts, you've had, I mean, the particular kind of canon and the history of it is long and contested, and I don't pretend to kind of mastered it, but you've got this right Hegelian tradition that tried to use Hegel as a justification for the church having a strong role in society, and to simplify it, to keep society as resembling as closely as possible the world of 1810 or 1807. So yeah, you're right to be concerned, but yeah, I do think Hegel is a faded memory, and yet seemingly more present than ever.
Other questions, comments? Okay, well, let's thank Seb.
Thank you very much for
it. So we can, I know, hang out for another 20 minutes or so until other people